Evening all. Apologies there was no Weekly Biscuit last week. There were just things going on in my life that required urgent attention, but fortunately most of those things have been sorted out. So we're back on schedule. So let's dive into the week's news. There's been, what's happened with the news this week is a number of stories that are interconnected with an overall theme. So I'm going to tackle those, starting with Brexit. Start at home and work my way out. So what we've seen this week is some positives and some weirdness. So on the one hand, finally the EU Withdrawal Act passed through Parliament, passed through House of Commons, passed through the House of Lords, and has been signed off with the royal assent. So that's gone into law. And what's been interesting is that on the one hand, it feels like a massive relief to people who support Brexit or who thinks the democratic process should be upheld. So that hurdle's cleared. But it's some of the other news that flowed from it. So one of the first things that came out, and I thought this was interesting because it plays into the kind of the centre and the right's fears about the European Union, namely the Article 13 of the European Copyright Act, which was a huge worry for those of us who broadcast on YouTube, but those of us who are independent content creators would find ourselves being unable to produce content without coming up against the European Union's laws on copyright, and we would then need to be part of large media corporations even to be able to broadcast or be able to do reviews, let's plays, even me. All that would have been impacted had this legislation gone through in the United Kingdom. But what I found interesting was that the government announced this. They kind of said it. The first thing that that happens as a consequence of passing of the withdrawal agreement is the government making an announcement that Article 13 of the European Copyright Act would not be carried out. It's almost as if the government's been listening to us on the internet. I don't know. Maybe it's just something a more mundane reason why they decided to announce that news. But I found it interesting. That's one of the first things that followed on from the withdrawal agreement being passed into law. So we're going to get the Brexit 50p coin as well. And I noticed a few months ago when the idea was put about that this coin would be minted, there were diehard Remainers saying they wouldn't even physically touch the coin, that they would refuse to handle it, or they would handle it just but only by touching it with gloves. Others suggested, and it all started off, one person suggested it, and it sort of caught on Twitter with other Remainers, that they were going to do something disgusting to the coin before handing it over to the cashier, and the cashier would refuse to handle the coin because it had disgusting stuff on it. One can only wonder what they had in mind. But the lunacy continues, but the lunacy is going higher up the fame chain, because Alistair Campbell, no less, he of illegal wars and badgering weapons inspectors to top themselves, allegedly. So he said he would point blank refuse to handle the coin and would say, no, I want two 20s and 10 rather than touching that disgraceful object. And if the cashier just said, I haven't got any, you're just going to have to take the coin. He then played a clip of, he said, this is what I'm going to say to them. And he played a clip of the actor Brian Cox saying F off very loudly and vehemently. So I don't know, is he going to do a Brian Cox impression, or is he going to carry around this clip? You know, on his phone he's going to have this clip with that Brian Cox moment, so he can just click and play it to the cashiers. Utterly bizarre behavior, utterly sort of weird and deranged, in my opinion. But that goes along with Hugh Grant's opinion. So he was asked, Hugh Grant, a man who can spot a winning cause, he said ironically. But Hugh Grant said the United Kingdom is finished. It's finished. Well, it's not finished. It's moving into a new phase, but one that he's not comfortable with. But then he's just as deluded. And the old soak Dave, who goes under the name of Steve Bray, the shouting permanent Brexit protester, was off in the European Parliament this week, walking around an empty chamber. It's kind of like a metaphor for his life. But there is a huge amount of derangement going on here. And most people have moved on from it, but it's just interesting to see. You'll get the usual weirdos on social media, the weird diehards, and the people whose only claim to fame is that they're freaky Brexit protesters like Supergirl and Old Soak Dave. But it's the celebrity meltdown. I mean, some have kind of begrudgingly dragged their feet and gone, well, we lost, we might as well get on with things, like Gary Lineker. But Hugh Grant and Alistair Campbell and Lord Adonis are just living in a deranged fantasy world. I would love it if somebody did a psychologist did this kind of psychological analysis of the extreme Remainer position, because I think it will keep the psychology profession busy for years, if not decades, to come. Just how do these people just have a screw loose, and they're unable to accept what's going on, or even to analyze what's going on, or even to analyze the weakness in their own position. I have repeatedly maintained on this channel that Brexit was 30 years in the making. And that if you want to understand, if you are a Remainer, the best thing you can do is try and understand why people became disillusioned with the European Union. Don't just think they're all bigots and that they all voted because of a collective leave of their senses. No, this has been building up. There has been a disillusionment, and you've got to look at your own position and say, what is it that we didn't get? What is it that we're failing to see? Listen to people, because the European Union isn't all fine and dandy. Everybody thinks it's kind of bringing peace and it's Erasmus programs. It's not. It's a federalization project, tax harmonization, legal harmonization, the absorption of all nations into a super European nation that has problems with it, the way it's structured. It's an anti-democratic institution that is largely unaccountable and pursues its own ends without regard to the citizens it's supposed to serve. And I think what happens is a lot of people see the EU simply as some kind of pooling of resources and a benevolent giver. It's not. It takes a huge amount in, and it gives you tiny little baubles back to amuse you. And I think if you are a diehard Remainer, you've got to understand, you've got to widen your horizons a little bit. But I don't think any diehard Remainer ever watches this channel anyway. So recently I've been watching a lot of sport. And but the sport's kind of leaking into other areas of culture, economics, and politics. And in particular, I want to highlight cricket, because I've been watching with great interest England versus South Africa in the cricket. And as I speak, England are on the verge of winning the entire series against South Africa, defeating it. It looks like it's going to be a 3-1 victory for England. England have quite comprehensively defeated South Africa in this series, outplayed them in everything except for the first test match. And even then, you can say that England lost it because they a lot of their players were suffering from illnesses. There was this kind of flu virus. They went around and they played a match not with a fully fit team, and with some of the players who were playing had the shits and were throwing up, not on the pitch, but so they weren't fit, and so they lost that one. But they've won 2 comprehensively since then, and they're about to win the 3rd. But what was interesting about this series is the decline of the South African cricket team. A few years ago, they were the #1 cricket team in the world champions. They've always fielded a strong team over the years. They've been one of the ones to beat. And yet, in the last couple of years, the team is starting to come apart. And part of this is something called Kolpak, which is, you can thank the European Court for that one, the Kolpak ruling. So way back, I think it was the 1980s, or perhaps early 1990s, there was a handball player called Kolpak. I think he was from an Eastern European country. Can't remember which one. But he claimed he had a right to play in the German leagues, not as a foreign player. And that was upheld by the European Court. And so now you could have people who can qualify as a non-overseas sportsman, even if they do hail from an overseas country, if they can prove some kind of connection to that country. So we've had a lot of South African players come to England to play cricket, and they cite the fact that they have either an English parent or grandparent, or they have a European. A lot of the Afrikaners are connected to the Dutch, and the Dutch are part of the European Union, so they can come over on a Kolpak deal, and they don't have to register as an overseas player. Now, also the economic policies of South Africa, which are pretty socialist, has led the rand to really decrease in value. And so South African cricketers are looking further afield to make money. And so they're abandoning South African cricket to either come to England, or in some cases they've gone to Australia, where the money is. So Australia have their own South African in their national cricket team, Marnus Labuschagne. And what happens is that also in South African cricket, they have a quota system because they wanted to encourage more black players. You see, what happened was that for decades, cricket was a white sport. Any black or coloured players wanting to play cricket had to play in their own leagues under apartheid, very poor quality pitches with barely any equipment. And so they never got the chance to play high-level professional cricket like the white players did. And they could never be selected for the national team. Well, of course, all that changed in the 1990s when South Africa were readmitted into international sport. And since then, the question has been, how do South Africa encourage more black players? How do they get more black players into the national team? Well, on the one hand, they've tried it at the first class, the domestic game, having a quota system of a certain amount of black players come in. But then what happens when you get really talented white players come in? You know, they can't get into South African sides, but they're talented. So yeah, again, English cricket or Australian cricket just go and harvest these talented players up. So, you know, come over here, you get citizenship, you get residency, and you know, you can play for England or Australia or even New Zealand. They have a South African in their side. So it's left the South African national team weak. The combination of the socialist economic policy, which is hurting the South African economy. So people are looking, you know, they need to play abroad to make money. And you have a quota system, which is letting talent slip through its fingers. You know, it's actually ending up having a detrimental effect where it should have been having a positive effect. You know, but hasn't this been the warning against quota systems all along? Obviously, you know, the solution would have been is to have talent searching programs in the townships, in the poorer areas, and getting top quality cricket facilities into these poor areas, from school age, and build the players up that way. But that hasn't been done. Well, not to the extent that it should have been done, and the money's just not there to invest. And so South African cricket is losing out. Good news for England, though. So I want to cross the pond over to America now. I'm not going to talk about the impeachment process because that is still, it's for something so flimsy, it's got quite murky. But a couple of things have emerged from it. First of all, there's Joe Biden, a man old enough to remember the original civil rights movement, saying that trans activism is the new civil rights, and that he's pledged to make trans rights, human rights on a par with everything else. Well, the problem is, the sticking point is, over the trans rights, is that what qualifies somebody as trans? Because the way the bar has been set very low. You just have to declare yourself as trans. You just have to declare yourself as the person of the opposite gender, or no particular gender at all, or any of the other 1,000 options that there are available. And that's it. That's just the minimum requirement. Well, what's happened is that everything falls down once you start looking into sport, once you start looking into the prison system, and once you start talking about the family unit and biology, and it all falls down at this point. And again, this doesn't play well with the normies. No one wants anybody physically assaulted because they're transsexual, or that they are, or transgendered, or that they're non-binary. Nobody wants physical assault, protected under law. But there has to be room for criticism. There has to be an option that says you can go this far, but you just can't. You can't get into the biological sphere. I mean, this is plain to see in sports. Right? A trans athlete is not on a par with a biological female athlete. It's just, I don't care what the activists say, where they say, the muscle there's a huge amount of muscle degradation with taking hormones and testosterone blockers. There aren't. There's certain, the physiology, the bone structure doesn't change, and the muscles don't deteriorate that much. And so it falls flat there. There has to be a recognition of limits as to how far this goes. It doesn't invalidate people as human beings. It shouldn't. That's not what trans rights should be about, not invalidating people's status as human beings and having the protection that all human beings have. But it's about reality. And it's just not there. So Biden thinks he's going to win over an intersectional crowd, but given that the amount of trans people in certainly in the Western world, as we know, is somewhere between 0.01 and 0.03. He's not going to get a lot of votes, and he's going to alienate a whole bunch of other people, unless he just wants to avoid getting harassed by the progressive media. But Biden has taken a very weak approach. But that's not the thing that really caught my eye about the news in America this week. And that was something about Joe Rogan. So Joe Rogan earlier on said he was supporting Bernie Sanders because even if he disagrees with some of Sanders' proposal, Rogan's reasoning was that the man's been consistent, throughout his entire political career. Yeah, the consistency of, on one level you think that's okay, but Sanders has been consistently crap with his politics. I remember somebody saying something similar about Tony Benn, was that the thing about Tony Benn was that he spent his entire political career being consistently wrong on perhaps every major issue. I know there's the Tony Benn quote about authority and where it derives from. the Tony Benn test. And that's about the best Tony Benn ever got. In all other matters, I think he was consistently wrong, and he was shown to be consistently wrong throughout his political career. And I think, this is what Joe Rogan is mentioning, that, he may have some things wrong, but at least he's consistently wrong. Now, I may be sort of misquoting Rogan there, but Rogan got a lot of blowback, but from different quarters. For one thing, there's a whole section of the progressive left that consider him in league with the Nazis. Somebody put out on Twitter a blue check mark that if you have a dinner party with a Nazi, if you have a dinner party and one of the guests is a Nazi, that makes you and all the other guests at the party who previously hadn't thought they were Nazis, that makes you a Nazi because you're sitting at the same table with a Nazi. Oh, well, that's great, because that means that Stalin and his government were Nazis because they signed the Nazi-Soviet pact with Nazi Germany, and they had Nazi ministers travel to the Soviet Union for meetings and stuff like that, and the Soviet foreign minister, Molotov, met with Hitler. So, yeah, it turned out all those communist guys, they were Nazis too. But so Rogan got blowback from the left, and he got some blowback, not as much blowback from the right, because hey, he was never our guy. Rogan's never been our guy. He has a very interesting format for an interview show. He has one of the best formats for an interview show out there. He just to have an extended, no time limit talk with people, chewing the fat, in a very kind of mostly relaxed atmosphere. And people like that, and people like Rogan as a personality. I was always skeptical about him because he jumped on that whole moon landing conspiracy bandwagon. But since then I've warmed to him a little bit more because I like his conversational style. But he was never the rights guy. He would just have he would have some of our guys on his show, and he wouldn't castigate them. Fair enough. But the strangest blowback is from his viewership, because he had the number one podcast in the world, and he's been overtaken. And who's he been overtaken by? Ted Cruz. I'm not joking. Ted Cruz has overtaken Joe Rogan as the most watched podcast. I think it could be in the world, but it certainly definitely is in America. Who'd have thunk it? So, I know that, and when that news came out on Twitter, people say, "Oh, the Zodiac Killer's the most popular person." Well, I always say this about Ted Cruz and the Zodiac Killer, and believe me, I've done a lot of research on the Zodiac Killer. And that is, it's pretty impressive that Ted Cruz was able to kill all those people a year before he was born. But here's the thing. Right, I've mentioned this on Twitter, but one of my sidelines is I'm determined to discover who the Zodiac Killer is. I think I've got a lead, because I think, having a look at the details of the case and who the victims were, not the cab driver, but the other victims that he killed at that kind of Inspiration Point location above San Francisco, was that they're all I think he knew the victims beforehand. I think it's somebody connected in the realm of education or youth work or something to do with campus life and all that. But there is the first girl that was killed. There's a photograph of her standing at some kind of party, at some kind of gathering. And standing right next to her is this guy that looks like the spitting image of the Zodiac Killer. He's got the hair, the horn-rimmed glasses, and that kind of really serious face that the artist's impressions of the Zodiac Killer have. And nobody can identify this guy in the photograph. There's just nobody. They've tracked down people who were around at that time, and nobody can identify him. And so, yeah, there you go. I think it was somebody who was known to the victims. But this is a digression. So go watch the movie. So the movie got the wrong conclusion, but it's a great analysis of how the investigation went. So where was I? Right, I'm going to end this week with an announcement of what I'm going to be producing. So I'm doing my next video. I've started on it, and it's the analysis of You Only Live Twice, the Bond movie. So I've recorded the narration for that, and I'm now doing the editing. After that, I've got two things lined up, and one of them I've got into hot water with, because I provisionally called this project called the Normie Manifesto, and I'm getting some blowback from the attack hamsters on this one. And I just want to explain here and now what the Normie Manifesto isn't. And that it's not me allying myself with normies. It's not me doing an apologetics video for the normies. And it's not me endorsing kind of what people have, my haters, both of them. I say that. Well, I have two confirmed haters. So they've said I've gone all basic cuck and everything. It's not, the Normie Manifesto isn't that. It's trying to summarize where the normies are in the culture wars and in politics. And the whole idea is that it's a video meant to detail to people on the left and right where the normies operate at in politics and culture, what they're prepared to accept, what they turn their noses up, what they balk at. And so it's not an endorsement, it's just a statement of where they are, with the hopes that anybody watching the video might better understand. So when you're trying to make your own political pictures and trying to explain your own politics to people, and if you're talking to normies at this, you will be better equipped to understand how they think, so you can pitch your ideas to them, knowing where their tolerance and where their limits are. You know, that's all it is. It's not a ringing endorsement. But hey, my haters are going to make up whatever crap they want to about what the video's about. Fine, don't watch it then. Good grief. And on that note, I'm just going to say the other one is about the 1966 movie Grand Prix. So it's going to be a film related one. But on that note, before I drop this again, that really takes a biscuit. Good night.